On behalf of the department, I'd like to welcome Professor Mearsheimer to Odense. You are one of the leading international thinkers of our time. We're very pleased to have you here. We greatly look forward to engaging you in the debate on theory and world events. And I have, of course, had the pleasure of reading your books, and I have also been able to follow the debates in which you have participated at academic conferences. There's this thing about these conferences, they involve lots of people, and if you want to locate the panels of Professor Mearsheimer, you just follow the crowd. Lots of people want to come and be inspired by Professor Mearsheimer. It gives me great pleasure, therefore, that Professor Mearsheimer can come to Odense and see what it's like when we lecture. You're all here today for it. Professor Mearsheimer, you have come from Chicago, American heartland, working power country, soil of long-range thinking, because you have accepted the invitation offered you by IntRpol. Let me use this occasion also to thank IntRpol for a magnificent effort. You guys are a great bunch of people with tremendous drive and great ideas. You make me feel old and slow every day. Let me put it this way. Iraq would be a beacon of opportunity and hope had you invaded the country in 2003. For the sake of the department, I'm glad you didn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words. It's a great pleasure to be here today at the University of Southern Denmark. And I too appreciate all the efforts of the people from IntRpol for arranging the conference and lining up all the sponsors. And if you think they make you feel old, they make me feel even older. I would especially like to thank Jakob Jorgensen and Rasmus Jakobsen, who were my two principal contacts here. And Jakob Jorgensen, who I knew when he was in Chicago, working at the Consul General's office, is principally responsible for this invitation. And I appreciate it greatly, because I'm really glad to be here. And I thank you all for coming out to hear me talk today. I'm always humbled to know that so many people actually care about what I have to say. When the Cold War ended, there was a tremendous amount of optimism in the land. And as you know, many people pronounced that this was the end of realism, despite the fact that this body of theory had a rich pedigree that went all the way back to Thucydides and had never come close to being knocked out of the saddle. Most people thought at the start of the early 1990s that it had been relegated to the dustbin of history. I think this worldview was best captured by Frank Fukuyama's very famous article, The End of History, which said that basically liberal democracy was sweeping the world, and because liberal democracies never fought against each other, the biggest problem that we would face in the future was boredom. And to be honest, I think the best case that could be made that realism had died was here in Europe, where throughout the 1990s, many people believed that war had been burned out of Europe, and it was only a matter of time before the peacefulness of Europe spread to other areas of the world. Today, it's much harder to make that case. In fact, there's a pretty profound sense of pessimism in the air in the United States about the future of international politics, and especially about America's role in the world. And lots of people are more sympathetic to the argument that realism is not dead today than was certainly the case in, let's say, 1991. What I'd like to do is to explain to you why I think realism is alive and well. And in making the case, I do want to emphasize up front that I'm not a realist because I'm glad that that's the way the world works. And I take a certain pleasure in looking out at the world and recognizing that it is, in many ways, a hellhole, and that this makes me feel good. That's not why I'm a realist. I'm a realist in large part because I think that's how the world works. This is not to say that realist theory can account for everything that happens in the world, because of course that's not the case. But I think among the body of international relations theories that we have, I think realism is probably the best of the lot. That's the reason I'm a realist. I think it has a lot of explanatory power. Not perfect, but a lot of explanatory power. And in a way, I find it kind of depressing that it does have as much explanatory power as it does. Now, the way I'd like to proceed is that first, I'd like to focus on the theory itself. And I'd like to talk about realist theory and pick it apart and explain to you why I think it's still relevant. And then I'd like to switch to the real world and talk about Asia, the Persian Gulf, and Europe, and explain why I think that realism still is applicable to those three areas of the world, which, in terms of great power politics, are the three most important spots on the planet. So let me start with the theoretical side first. Realism, as everybody knows, is a theory that says states care greatly about the balance of power, and they compete with each other for power in what is essentially a zero-sum game. There are two kinds of realism, as almost all of you know. One is human nature realism, and the other is structural realism. Human nature realism basically argues that all individuals are wired with a type A personality and a will to power, to put it in slightly different terms, or to put it in Hans Morgenthau's famous terms, an animus dominandi. And because individuals run particular countries around the world, those leaders who make foreign policy in individual countries are driven by this will to power, and they want their country to be the most powerful state on the planet. The structural realist story, which I'm identified with, argues that human nature does not have much to do with the security competition that we see among the great powers, and that it's largely a function of the structure of the international system, or to put it in slightly different terms, the architecture of the international system. So the argument I want to make today is that that basic architecture, that basic structure, has hardly changed at all as a result of the end of the Cold War, and that for that reason, realism is alive and well. So let me just lay out my basic theory and then pick at it. As some of you know, I start off with a rather simple set of assumptions about the world. Then I take those assumptions and I put them in the blender and I hit the on switch. And you get three kinds of behaviors, the most important of which is that states compete for power and try to maximize the amount of power that they have, because that's the best way to survive in the international system. So I start with these five assumptions and then mix them up and get these three forms of behavior. So what I want to do is I want to lay out the five assumptions. then talk briefly about the behaviors. And then what I want to do, and this is very important, is I want to pick at the assumptions, because I do believe that if you can undermine any of my assumptions, the assumptions that underlie the theory collapses. And if I had 2 hours to give a lecture, I could show you how many of the critics of realism actually target those assumptions, and how certain realists themselves try to make realism more benign by going after those assumptions. So whenever you deal with a structural realist theory like mine, it's very important to look carefully at the assumptions. And if you're interested in trying to take me down, if you're interested in trying to undermine my argument, the way you want to do it is you want to go after 1 or 2 assumptions, because those assumptions are basically the foundation on which the theory is built. Okay, so what are the assumptions? The first assumption is the familiar assumption that states are the principal actors in the system and they operate in an anarchic environment. And as you all know, when we talk about anarchy, we don't mean murder and mayhem. Anarchy is simply an ordering principle. It's the opposite of hierarchy in the realist story. So my first assumption is that states are the key actors and there's no higher authority above them. There's no ultimate arbiter above them. They operate in an anarchic system. They're like balls on a pool table. My second assumption, another straightforward assumption I believe, is that all states have some offensive military capability. It varies from case to case, but all states have some offensive military capability, even if they have a rather bedraggled military like Colonel Gaddafi. My third assumption, which is a very, very important assumption, and I'll talk more about this as I go along, is that states can never be certain about the intentions of other states. This is not to say you can be certain that another state has malevolent intentions. It's just to say you can't be sure that a state today has good or bad intentions towards you, and you certainly can't be sure over the long term. To give you an example that highlights this, let's think about marriage and divorce. When people get married, they invariably think that the person that they're marrying is truly wonderful. At least I hope that's the case. But nevertheless, in the United States, we have a divorce rate that hovers around 50%. That means that lots of people who got married thinking that they were marrying someone who had wonderful intentions towards them ended up marrying somebody whose intentions changed over time. You can never be sure when you get married what that person will think about you in 10 or 20 or 30 years. You just can't know. It's a rather depressing fact of life, but nevertheless, it is true. The same thing is true with countries. Who knows who will be the prime minister of Denmark in 20 or 30 years? And therefore, who knows what his or her intentions will be towards country X, Y, or Z? You simply can't know the future because we have no facts about the future. To come back to the present, talk a little bit more about intentions because you want to think long and hard about this. My second assumption, to go back up to my second assumption, was that all states have some degree of offensive capability. Underline that word capability. Now, my third assumption, which I was just talking to you about, was uncertainty about intentions. We always talk in the security business about capabilities and intentions. Well, how do you measure intentions? Intentions are in people's heads. You cannot see them. If you want to measure capabilities, you can count how many tanks, how many aircraft carriers, how many missiles a potential adversary has. But if you're trying to see what that adversary's intentions are, you can't see them. They're not visible. They're in the person's head. And then again, even if you are confident that you can assess what an opposing leader's present intentions are, you're always stumped by the fact that it's almost impossible to figure out what future intentions are. Okay? So I've laid out 3 assumptions for you. First is that states are the principal actors in the system, and the system is anarchic, not hierarchic. 2, all states have some offensive military capability. And number 3, states can never be certain about the intentions of other states. 4th and 5th assumptions, which I'm actually not going to pay much attention to, they're rather straightforward, and we can talk about them in the Q&A if people would like to. 4th assumption is that the highest goal of states is to survive. Survival is the principal goal. It's not the only goal, it's the principal goal. And the reason that it's the principal goal is because if you don't survive, you can't pursue all those other goals. And the 5th assumption is that states are strategic calculators. They're reasonably good at understanding their threat environment and making the necessary adjustments and coming up with the appropriate strategies for dealing with the problems that they face. So those are the 5 assumptions. Now, as I said to you at the beginning, you take those 5 assumptions and you put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, and you get 3 forms of behavior. The first form of behavior you get is that states fear each other. That level of fear, for sure, varies from case to case, but states tend to fear each other. Now, why is that the case? First of all, they fear each other because they may find themselves in a situation where a neighbor has significant offensive capabilities and malign intentions towards them. If you're France in the 1920s, you worry about the possibility that Germany will rearm and have significant offensive capability, and that the future German leader will have malign intentions towards you, France. So states fear each other because they can never be certain about another state's intentions, and that state may have significant offensive capability. Second reason that they fear each other is that when you live or operate in an anarchic system where there's no night watchman or no ultimate arbiter, if you do get into trouble, there is no one you can call. In the United States, we have a system called 911, where if you get into trouble and you want to call the police, you dial 911. There's no 911 in the international system. When you dial 911, nobody picks up because there's no higher authority. That leads to the second form of behavior. Remember, the first form of behavior was fear. The second form of behavior is self-help. States quickly understand that the best way to protect yourself in a system where there's no higher authority and you may run into trouble with another state is to make sure you take care of yourself, because you really can't depend on anybody else. The third form of behavior is, in many ways, the most important. That as a result of this fear, what states do is they try to maximize their relative power. They try to be as powerful as possible relative to the other actors in the system. Because the more powerful you are, the less likely it is that anyone will attack you. Just think about the United States and the Western Hemisphere. As you all know, the United States is a remarkably powerful country, but it is especially powerful relative to its neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. We've got the Canadians on our northern border. We've got the Mexicans, the Cubans, the Guatemalans, the El Salvadorians on our southern border. This is an absolutely wonderful situation because none of these countries would ever think about attacking the United States because we are so powerful. Think about if you're China. Wouldn't you like to be the most powerful state in Asia by far? Wouldn't you like to be 25 times more powerful than Japan? Remember what happened when you were much weaker than Japan? It was not pretty. Not at all. The Russians, the Indians, you want them to be as small as possible relative to you. You want them to be weak. Because again, the ultimate goal in the structural realist story is to survive. And the best way to survive, to put it in colloquial American terms, is to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. Because then nobody fools around with you. That is the basic structural realist story. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at three of the key assumptions that underpin this story that I just told you. One, I want to look at the states and anarchy assumption. Two, the offensive capability assumption. And the uncertainty about intentions assumption. And as I said to you before, I think if you can't take one of those assumptions away from me, you can't knock my theory down. And my theory has, therefore, a good amount of explanatory power. Again, not a perfect theory, but a quite powerful theory. So you've got to be able to take those assumptions down. Let's start with states and anarchy. The key here is nationalism. Nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the planet. Because you Europeans have been operating in the shadow of the United States for so long, you are used to hearing the argument that democracy is the most powerful ideology in the world. And if you want to understand international politics and think about intervention here, there, and everywhere, what you want to think about is spreading democracy. This is a wrong-headed way of thinking about the world. And in fact, when you think that way, you end up in quagmires like Iraq and Afghanistan. What's very important to understand is that nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the face of the earth. And nationalism privileges the state. Nationalism is an ideology that says that the world is comprised of numerous nations or ethnic groups or tribes. And each one of those nations wants its own state. Just think about the word nation-state. The two-part definition of nationalism that I just gave you is embodied in the word nation-state. The world is divided up into nations, there's nation, and each one of those nations would like to have its own state. Let's go to the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is Zionism? Zionism is Jewish nationalism. It's all about the Jews in Europe moving to Palestine in large numbers and getting a state of their own. What are the Palestinians interested in now? The Palestinians are interested in getting a state of their own. When we talk about a two-state solution, we're talking about giving the Palestinians, the Palestinian nation, a state of its own. When the Jews talk about having a Jewish state, that's Jewish nationalism. That's what Zionism is all about. But what this tells you is that the state is alive and well. Because in a world where nationalism is the most powerful ideology, there's no way that the state is going to go away. The state is here to stay. And in fact, given the power of nationalism, what you see today is a planet that is populated by states. If you went back 100 years ago, there were not that many states on the planet. If you went back to 1945, there were not many states on the planet. If you went back to 1500, there were no states on the planet. Basically, the evolution of the political order on the planet since 1500 has been all about the rise of the state. And we now live in a world where the globe is populated by states. What about anarchy? What about the idea of those states coming together and forming some sort of agreement to create a higher authority? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because nationalism is a particularistic ideology. It privileges one's own group. And there's very little interest in a marriage with the other. In most cases, there's an interest in divorce, not marriage. Look at the former Yugoslavia. Look at the former Czechoslovakia. Look at the former Soviet Union. If you want to go further back in time, you remember the Ottoman Empire? You remember the Austro-Hungarian Empire? All gone. Why? Nationalism. More and more states. So we are going to live in an anarchic world. Again, anarchy here is just an ordering principle. We're going to live in an anarchic world dominated by states for as far as the eye can see. So that first assumption remains intact. Second assumption is that all states have some offensive military capability. Here is where you had a potential threat to the basic realist story, and some people argue you still do. And the argument is that with the coming of nuclear weapons, it's become almost impossible for one great power to fight a war against another great power. The threat of nuclear escalation is simply so horrific that no two states would fight a war. Therefore, you're not going to get a serious security competition. A good example of this would be, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, I believe that China cannot rise peacefully, and I believe that if China continues to grow economically, it will turn that economic might into military might, and there will be an intense security competition between the United States and China. I think the best argument against my position is that this is not tenable in a nuclear world. And some of my friends who hear my argument say, John, it's a very interesting argument, but ultimately it does not carry the day because you don't take into account that we live in a nuclear world. And nuclear weapons are defensive weapons in the extreme, and they make it almost impossible for a great power to fight against another great power. I have two responses to that, one of which I'll make here, second of which I'll make in due course. The first is, we had nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an intense security competition, and I believe that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came very close to going over the ledge. So I think the Cold War shows quite clearly that nuclear weapons do not so thoroughly favor the defense that you can't have serious security competition between great powers. And as I'll say in a few minutes, I do think that there are certain situations, certain flashpoints in Asia that raise the specter of a possible war between the United States and China down the road. I'm not saying that's likely, but I'm saying it's possible. So I don't think the offensive capability argument is off the table. What about uncertainty about intentions, which, as I emphasized to you, is a very important assumption. We still have no way of figuring out what the intentions of other states are. Let's just talk about China for a second. Again, getting ahead of myself. First of all, it's very hard to figure out what Chinese intentions are today, especially when you look at how rambunctious the Chinese have been in Asia over the past 14 months. But even if you think it's easy to figure out what Chinese intentions are today, it's impossible to discern what Chinese intentions will be in the year 2020 or in the year 2030. We simply can't know. Because again, it's impossible to divine the future intentions of any state. This, by the way, is one of my arguments against facilitating the growth of China. I have a number of friends, basically liberal international relations theorists, who believe that what you want to do is get China hooked on global capitalism, which has already happened, and help China get richer and richer, because as China gets richer and richer, and as the United States gets richer and richer, neither one of them will start a war against the other, because who would want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? That's the basic argument. From a realist perspective, this horrifies me. Why does it horrify me? Because why would I help facilitate the creation of a very, very powerful state, a state that has the capability to be much more powerful than the United States when I can't be sure what its intentions will be? There's no way that anybody can assure me that China will have benign intentions. So China may have malevolent intentions towards the United States or towards the Japanese or towards the Indians. I can't know that. So if I can't know what their intentions are going to be, the last thing I want to do is help that state become more and more powerful. I often tell students, if we had to rerun history and it was 1919 all over again, World War I had just ended, and you have to think about how to deal with Germany, what do you do? And of course, most of my liberal friends, and this includes most of my realist friends who are closet liberals, most of my liberal friends would say we should not impose a Carthaginian peace. Instead, what we should do is treat the Germans much more nicely than we did last time. My view is you want to break Germany up into about 8 different pieces. You don't want to treat them more nicely. You don't want to help them grow more and more because you cannot be certain what their intentions will be. They will respond to me, well, John, if you treated them nicely this time around, then Hitler wouldn't come to power and you wouldn't have the problem in 1939 that you actually did have. My response to that is you didn't need Hitler to start World War I. You Danes in the audience remember 1864, I'm sure. Hitler wasn't driving the train back then, was he? It was Otto von Bismarck, who's revered by most statesmen these days. He started wars in 1864, 1866, and 1870. Right? So the idea that I would allow Germany, after World War I, to reestablish itself and to become powerful again, it's not the way I operate. I believe that it's very important to make sure that you are much more powerful than all your neighbors. Why? Because you cannot be certain about another state's intentions. So my bottom line from a theoretical point of view, is that the basic assumptions that underpin the structural realist story remain firmly intact. And therefore, from a theoretical point of view, we should not expect the 21st century to look like the 1990s. We should expect the 21st century to look like past centuries, where there will be great power competition and there will be great power wars, maybe not between the great powers themselves, but between great powers and minor powers.